Each year, the US runs massive trade deficits with the rest of the world. In recent years, this imbalance has climbed to nearly $1 trillion annually. We're being ripped off.
We cannot continue to be ripped off. We're ripped off by so many countries, and we're stopping it.
I'm sure we've all heard Trump's solution by now.
We're doing tariffs. Tariff will be substantial. Tariffs.
But what if we have it backwards? What if the US was actually winning at foreign trade? But how? Clearly, money go down bad, right? How can the US maintain such a large trade deficit without the consequences other countries face when they do the same? Well, let's think about this for a second. In 2024, the US recorded a trade deficit of nearly $1 trillion with the rest of the world. Oil, cars, pharmaceuticals, food, machinery, computers, phones, precious metals poured into the US. In exchange, what did the rest of the world get? All the rest of the world asked for was $1 trillion of our debt. Sure, it's only fair since this is going to cost us $1 trillion, right? That's American taxpayer money footing the bill, you say. Actually, it isn't. Contrary to what we're told, federal taxes do not pay for government spending. In fact, when federal taxes are paid, your money simply gets deleted. Or if you pay in cash, they burn it. In order to pay exporters, all the US had to do was spend US dollars into existence. The government just created it. The cost is the effort it takes to enter some digits into a computer, which is apparently really difficult since Citibank recently nearly credited one of their customers $81 trillion. But you don't have to listen to me. Take the words of former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, quote, "It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed, much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. It's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing." End quote. In short, those dollars came from nowhere. They were created out of thin air, ex nihilo. They're just some numbers keystroked into the account balances of banks from exporter countries like Mexico, Canada, China, Japan, Germany, and so on. Put simply, if those countries did not want US dollars, then the trade would not happen. Both parties are getting what they want. Exporters are getting US dollars, and the US is getting tangible goods. So we're not exactly losing. The problem is that Trump and many others see money leaving and assume real wealth is leaving the United States. But what is the real wealth of a nation? In his paradigm-shifting paper, The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, modern monetary theory founder Warren Moser defines it succinctly. The real wealth of a nation is all it produces and keeps for itself, plus all it imports minus what it must export. In other words, imports are real benefits and exports are real costs. Okay, but what happens when other countries have our money? What can they do with it? What can they do to us with it? And what about the US jobs that were lost to globalization? That's a big reason people voted for Trump in the first place. Let's start with our money, using China as an example. If we give a bunch of money to China, what's stopping them from buying up our country? First, we are a nation with rules that state clearly what is for sale and what is not for sale. Exporting countries have read these rules and still determined that it was worth it to give us real wealth in exchange for digits on a spreadsheet. Second, China is over there and the US is over here. If you think China owning our companies or farmland is a problem, then the problem is that they were for sale to China in the first place. If it isn't for sale, then they can't buy it, no matter how many of our dollars they have. Congress has the power to set those rules, and we have the power to elect Congress. Foreign countries holding dollars are just like anyone else holding dollars. Like land or any other asset the US has direct control over, they can be confiscated however the US sees fit. Ironically, war, both economic and military, is the biggest force undermining the dollar status as the world's reserve currency. Yet the US still insists on a belligerent foreign policy, instigating and fanning the flames of war all around the globe. On the economic war front, we're sanctioning nearly a third of the world, the majority being low-income countries. So the rest of the world is left with a dilemma. What do they do with our money? They could buy our exports and the trade deficit would go down, or they could buy another country's exports. If they give those dollars to another country, the decision to spend or save US dollars is now that other country's problem, and so on and so forth. But exporting countries often elect to just pocket the money. Naturally, when you save, you want to earn interest so the money grows over time. So all a foreign country does is take their regular dollars and swap them for interest-bearing dollars. They buy US Treasury securities. They move money from a checking account to a savings account. Yet we're constantly told that the US is borrowing from China or borrowing from US taxpayers. The argument that we have to make sure the money is there before we spend it. But in reality, it's just as MMTers, former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, and many others, including the Bank of England, have repeatedly said. The government creates new money when it spends.
And one of the key points of the article is that banks create additional broad money whenever they make a loan. Now, while this is nothing new, it is sometimes overlooked as the main way in which money is created, and it runs contrary to the view sometimes put forward that banks can only lend out deposits that they already have. In fact, loans create deposits, not the other way around.
Before anyone can pay a tax or buy a bond, the government has to spend the required currency into existence first. Foreign savings are not funding our spending. Our spending is funding foreign savings. The mainstream have it completely backwards. When the US government creates dollars, it's not because it needs its own dollars. It wants other people to need its dollars, so it can provision itself with material wealth. In terms of foreign trade, we benefit when other countries want our dollars in exchange for their tangible goods. But the money we spend on imports can be thought of as a leakage. Money that is spent and subsequently saved can no longer circulate in the economy. Technically, US dollars can never leave their currency area no matter where they are physically in the world, only the ownership in accounts changes. The problem is that one person's spending is another person's income. If foreigners do not invest their savings back into our domestic economy, then less money circulates, which means less money is available to be paid as income, and the economy shrinks and contracts. But there's an easy solution. The government can easily step in and spend into the economy to offset the leakages taking money out of it. The loss of US jobs due to globalization or any other excuse now becomes clear. It's a policy choice. The government is the currency issuer. It can never go broke. Governments can always buy whatever is for sale in their own currency. The limit to government spending is whether there are real resources available for purchase. Labor is one of those resources, and has historically never been fully employed apart from wartime. We have the ability to spend enough money to give every able-bodied person in the US a job. The fact that the government never checks its wallet when it's time to spend on the military tells you where their priorities lie. It's no wonder the US military is always hiring. The Department of Defense is the largest employer in the nation. If you join, you can finally get the free healthcare you always wanted, subsidized housing, 30 days paid leave, retirement, college tuition assistance, on paper at least. But we can do all this for the average person as well. People in the US simply need to be offered jobs that pay enough to consume all the world sends them and all that they produce at home. The US can always issue enough money to buy all the labor and capital priced in US dollars that it wants, to achieve whatever public purpose it wants, so long as the real resources are available and demand for the currency exists. And what creates demand for a currency? Taxes. All nations that can tax in their own currency create demand for their currency. What does this mean? By imposing a tax liability in its currency, the government effectively makes you unemployed. It then hires you to do what it wants in exchange for its currency. The government defines the value of its currency based on the prices it pays when it spends. You can now pay the tax, and if there's money left over, you can save. If you don't pay the tax, you face a penalty. Logically then, a government that demands a tax from you is responsible for making sure you can pay it, since you can't pay the tax until the government gives you its currency. This sequence is why we say taxes cannot fund government spending. Spending comes before taxation. Government spending creates money, taxation deletes money. Some say taxes are enforced violently. It depends on your politics. It depends whether you see the government as working for you or against you. In a true democracy, the government is elected by us, by the will of the people. In such a society, the privilege to tax has been ceded to the government through democratic process. the social contract. We elect you to look out for us. On the other hand, if a government is unelected or undesired, you could make the case that the tax liability is violently imposed against the will of the people. Taxation without representation. But why tax if governments don't need their own money to spend? We tax to prevent inflation, which we can only reach once there is nothing left to buy, no labor left to employ. We tax to unemploy resources that are currently fully employed, and we're nowhere near that. No one even considers that more employment can actually be anti-inflationary. By hiring more people, you're getting more people involved in the production process. That's more hands on deck to create a larger surplus. You could grow more food. You could produce more widgets. We could reduce working hours by more evenly dividing the collective workload of society. You could hire people to build out solar farms, eliminating the monopoly pricing power of fossil fuel companies. The United States is a massive territory. We could easily leverage the trade deficit to acquire tons of cheap renewables and hire the necessary labor at home to build out a green energy infrastructure so vast the US would become a net exporter of green energy to the globe. A public works program surpassing the sort and scale implemented during the FDR administration. A Green New Deal. Until we've reached fully automated, gaze-based communism, unemployment is a cost. A human one and an economic one. Where is the logic in barely paying for people to be idle? The government should be spending until everyone willing and able to work is employed at a dignified wage, and then taxing whenever the public purpose changes in order to free up the necessary resources and labor required to achieve it. A job guarantee. The government can do this by either cutting taxes or increasing spending, or a combination of both, since they essentially have the same effect of increasing the government deficit. And what does the government deficit represent? Our savings. By basic accounting identity, we know that money is one person's asset and another person's liability. Double entry bookkeeping. A government deficit simply represents the total savings of the non-government sector, penny for penny. You and I are part of the non-government sector. If the US government deficit was zero, then we would have $0 in savings. Money is a tax credit. The government deficit simply amounts to all the dollars the government has spent into the economy and not yet collected back in taxes. You'll realize that once you add the non-government surplus and government deficit together, they equal zero. They balance. Either the government is in debt or everyone else is in debt. You cannot have a surplus without a deficit, and you cannot have a deficit without a surplus. Foreign trade works the same way. In order for countries like the US or UK to run trade deficits, other countries must run trade surpluses. Likewise, for export-led countries like China or Germany to run trade surpluses, they need other countries to run trade deficits. Unfortunately, Eurozone countries like Germany or Greece cannot issue a sovereign currency. They are currency users of the euro, just as US states like California and New York are currency users of USD. They are artificially constrained to budgeting like a household would. Within the Eurozone, in order to accommodate Germany's desire to run trade surpluses, its neighbors like Greece must run trade deficits. When a country like Greece runs a sustained trade deficit, it runs the risk of running out of euros, a foreign currency which it cannot print. Greece can and has gone broke before. In Germany's case, when its trade partners start reducing the trade deficit, that cuts directly into its profits. Running trade surpluses means Germany requires its people to spend more time producing goods for the consumption of foreigners rather than themselves. By exporting, they're saying we need what other nations can give us more than we need the goods we've made. This is the problem with an export-led growth model. For an advanced nation like Germany, this has mostly become an exercise in exporting for the sake of exporting. It's less about receiving material benefit in exchange and more about the endless accumulation of foreign currencies on spreadsheets. Returning to the US, Trump views winning at trade as exporting more stuff than we import. Yet at the same time, he claims to want a strong dollar and for other countries to keep using it. But the strength of the dollar is the fact that other countries are willing to give us real stuff in exchange for it. To win at exporting, you would actually want the dollar to fall in value so that US exports become more competitive. Exporter countries don't want our exports though, they want our dollars. That's our export product. Export-led countries effectively use our dollars as reserves to discount their own domestic currency creation against. By reducing the current account deficit, we reduce the amount of dollars the rest of the world holds. Over time, as more countries develop, they'll start looking at their pile of goods and our dollars differently. They'll have less motivation to just send away their stuff for another country to consume, and more motivation to increase their own domestic consumption. De-dollarization will likely be a gradual process, although our leaders seem hell-bent on accelerating it. Though highly unlikely, demand for dollars collapsing overnight would be painful for a United States that has gradually become more dependent on imports. We'd have to sanction ourselves from the rest of the world for that to really happen, given most countries at the present aren't satisfied with the amount of dollars they have and want more. They actually want to send us more stuff. I see de-dollarization as more of a process in which the USD loses its hegemonic status as the world transitions to a basket of currencies, of which USD is a part of. And not a total collapse of the dollar, since that would suggest a total collapse of the US as a state. How GDP is measured is partly to blame for this overemphasis on export-led growth above all else. At its core, there's nothing wrong with the Made in America strategy at all. If the US perceives the rise of other nations as threats to itself, it would naturally want to de-risk by reducing its dependence on foreign-made goods. Deindustrialization in the US never needed to happen. The US always had the capacity to offer jobs supposedly displaced by imports. An increase in imports actually gave the US leeway to focus on other sectors not covered by imports. And during the 90s, we had an increase in employment despite a rising current account deficit. To pretend like there aren't any jobs to be done is to pretend like the US has no problems to solve. Spend less than 5 minutes in any metropolitan area in the US and you'll immediately realize there's a lot of work to be done. We could start by housing the homeless. Why don't we make sure everyone has access to clean water and healthy food? Our infrastructure is falling apart. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave it a C- grade in 2021. Why not build out more public transportation to reduce car dependency, take pressure off roadways, and revive cities? Why drill? Why not continue building out more renewable energy infrastructure like the southern US states have been doing? Not only would it be great for the environment, but we'd also reduce the monopoly pricing power of fossil fuel companies. We're going to need to go beyond tariffs and actually invest in the public. We can start with a job guarantee. You don't even have to reinvent the wheel policy-wise. Just start where FDR left off, minus the internment camps and redlining, and go from there. A Green New Deal. What the US needs right now is not export-led growth. It needs to focus on fixing its problems at home. We're already winning at trade. Only the US could take what is an immense net benefit to itself and use it as an excuse to create unemployment and unwarranted suffering at home. The argument that we're losing because we don't send the world more stuff than they send us doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Exports are costs, imports are benefits. I'll just end this with another point Mosler makes often. Quote, if, for example, General MacArthur had proclaimed after World War II that since Japan had lost the war, it would be required to send the US 2 million cars a year and get nothing in return, the result would have been a major international uproar about US exploitation of conquered enemies. End quote. It's not fair. We're trading digits for widgets. We're ripping them off. Here's Trump making that point in 2019.
Prime Minister Abe, great guy. I said, listen, we have a massive deficit with Japan. They send us thousands and thousands, millions of cars. We send them wheat. Wheat. That's not a good deal.
I try to be careful when I talk about MMT since I'm no expert and don't want to misrepresent it in any way. I've added my own personal spin by making this video. If all this sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend reading The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. She breaks MMT concepts down in clear and concise language with easy-to-understand anecdotes and examples. She also runs a Substack. I linked to an article she wrote on the topic of trade that includes a well-made 10-minute video by one of her students that I reference heavily in the making of this video. I've also included all of my sources. I recommend reading fellow MMTer Bill Mitchell's blog, where he talks about this. The MMT Economics subreddit is also a great forum to ask questions and get answers. I also highly recommend watching the Finding the Money documentary. It really needs to be shown in classrooms everywhere. It's essential information about what money actually is and how it works. It's available on multiple streaming platforms, including YouTube. The MMT Podcast is another great resource, as well as the Real Progressives podcast for left-wing MMT. I'm going to leave all the links to these MMT resources and more in the description so people can read and hear the direct source material instead of myself. Thanks for watching. Also, let me get all the keywords in real quick. Nvidia, real estate, gold, Graham Stephan, finance, crypto, Bitcoin, stocks, trading, compound interest, ETFs, Vanguard, bonds. All right, that's enough.